All right, we're going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. And this is the House Revenue Committee. And we've got, let's go ahead and do the roll call. Donna?
Roll call for House Revenue. Representative Brown.
Present.
Representative Campbell.
Here.
Representative Lean.
Here.
Representative Lucas.
Present.
Representative Riggins excused. Representative Storer.
Here.
Representative Stivar.
Present.
Representative Worf. Chairman Locke.
Present.
8 present and 1 excused. We have a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
All right. All right, I want to welcome everyone here for this, for these bills that we're going over today. We've got 3 bills we're going to go over, but before I talk about it, I'll talk just a little bit about, please keep your cell phone silenced. Please respect everything goes through the chair just to make sure we keep everything calm and smooth. And everybody, please respect the people who are up speaking. And again, I thank you all for coming and attending this morning. I really do appreciate that. Let's see here. Let's see, let's go ahead. So the bills we're going to be going over today, guess I needed this sheet on top. Sorry about that. So bills we'll be going over today is first we're going to be going over House Bill 279, Property Tax Exemptions Order of Application. And we'll do House Bill 282, Property Tax Acquisition Value. And then House Bill 113, Insurance Payments Not Taxable. If we get to that one, I don't know if we will. We'll see how we do, but we'll try to get to that one. So committee and the room, we are going to start off with House Bill 279. And Representative Nicholas, thank you so much for being here this morning and to present the bill. I can relate to that.
I'm just going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to, the basis of this bill, but I'm going to turn over the explanation to our good Director of Revenue, because she understands it more than I do. But you should have received at one point in time documents that outline what the issues are. When did that go out?
Thank you, Director.
Mr. Chairman, prior to the session, I had identified this math calculation concern that the agency had, and I believe shared it with the chairs, and then I believe that you had shared it with the committee at that point.
Yes, I shared it with the whole group here. So this is actually the issue that you brought up before the session. Thank you.
So just in a nutshell, as we implement and pass different laws, including the 4% cap on property tax increase over time, annually, and then we had the 25% increase, we had long-term homeowners increases, and a few other things. When you stack those on top of each other, if you don't implement them in the right order, if you go out of sequence, you have strange results, which were unanticipated from and not thought about as we went through last year and implemented those bills. And a simple way to say it is, if you have a house that's worth, let's say, $500,000, if you don't, you'll go to the next year and it's now worth $600,000. How you implement those property tax relief bills matters, because otherwise it doesn't, your end result doesn't work out right. You have to prioritize them, because if your house appreciates over time, and let's say it appreciates more than the 4%, so then you have a current valuation, a past evaluation, you have a 4% increase, and then you have to figure out what that 25% increase on the long-term property value. you're ended up getting like a 55 or a 60% tax increase or relief, depending on what year and what order of relief that you receive. And Brenda presented this to our Joint Appropriations Committee in December, and to you again in January, to some of us. But none of us were smart enough to grab the bill and actually present it. So I got a phone call from her office and said, hey, we need this bill badly. So thus this bill. And that's about the extent of that I know about the bill. So I'm just the messenger. So I'm going to turn over the explanation.
Thank you, Representative Nicholas, and thank you, Director. Please.
Mr. Chairman, Brenda Henson, Director of the Department of Revenue, and thank you, Representative, for sponsoring this bill. As legislation was going through the session last year, each on an individual track, correct? But you don't know until it's over and the dust settles what exemptions are going to pass. So what I'd like to do is take you back to each of those exemptions. So last year, we passed an exemption on the single-family residential structure. What that exemption is any amount of value that exceeds 4% above the prior year assessed value. So we've got a cap and an exemption. That was applicable for 2024. We're okay there. Now we run into 2025. Here's the rest of the story that passed last year. Now we have that exemption, and then we have a cap on land, the associated residential land. That's a 4%. On top of that, in 2025, we also have the long-term homeowners exemption, which is 50%. From the Department of Revenue's perspective, our initial thought was, we assumed, we know how bad that is, we assumed that the legislative intent was that if the 4% cap was applicable, we apply that on the res, we apply it on the land, and then the net value is what we would apply this long-term homeowners exemption to. Well, we started looking at the bills. So all of the bills talk about assessed value. So we talk about the 4% cap on the residential structure. It's a 4% cap on the assessed value. The next exemption, long-term homeowners, 50% of the assessed value of the residential property. There was another bill that was vetoed last year, and that was a 25% of the fair market value, or obviously assessed value. So the way each of these individual bills went through the session appear that we would do the 4% cap. And then we would go back on the long-term homeowners and apply the 50% to our starting value. Well, what does that do? We're exempting value that we've already exempted in the 4% cap if it was applicable. So we believe that the net was the intent of the legislature based on the testimony and discussions, but that's not what the bills say. The bills always take us back to the starting point of fair market value and assessed value, which is only after we apply the level of assessment. So what this bill does is it puts in a process by which the math is calculated. And the reason for an individual bill is there was discussion with LSO staff in trying to figure out with the plethora, that's a big word, plethora of property tax relief bills that we have on the table this year. How do we write this math in each of them to ensure that they're applied uniformly in every county assessor's office? And we found that maybe it's just easier if we put it in one place in the exemption statutes, and this bill does that. When you're looking at House Bill 279, it's in 3911-105. See, on page 2, it says, for any property where more than one exemption applies to the same property, this is the manner in which you should apply. We've never had this situation historically in Wyoming where we've got multiple exemptions that apply to that same residential structure. And so the first item on this order is if the exemption is a portion of the is to a portion of assessed value of the property, this exemption shall be applied in a sequence so that you're applying it to the modified number by the preceding exemption. Okay. The next paragraph says, okay, what is the order? So it's the lowest percentage to the highest percentage. So in 2025, and that's why this bill's important right now, is because it's applicable to 2025 assessment schedules that have to go out by the fourth Monday in April. So if the 4% cap is applicable, the assessor is to calculate that. And then the next exemption, if they qualify for the long-term homeowners, is to apply that 50% to the net after the exemption that was the 4% cap. Now, not all properties will have the 4% cap, just those that exceeded, that went up that much. But at least this math then works. Then what it says is, so let's say, for example, the 25% had gone into law for 2025. If that law would have went into place, the assessors would have, based on this language, applied the 4% cap, then the 25% exemption to the residential structure, and then applied the long-term homeowners to the net after each of those steps. I hope that is clear. The key is if you change the order, you get different numbers, and that's not appropriate for our taxpayers. And the taxpayers are the ones that are going to get those assessment schedules, those tax bills, and say, wait a minute, I qualified for this, and this is how I do the math. Now, there's one more piece to this bill, and then I'll answer any questions. Exemptions not based on a percentage of property value shall be applied after any exemptions that are based on percentage of property value. Right now, that's our veterans exemption. So what that does is in 2025, assessors will apply the 4% cap, land and structures. Then if the property owner qualifies for the long-term homeowners, they'll apply the 50% to the net after the cap. And then if they apply and qualify for the $6,000 assessed dollars for veterans, that will be applied to the net after the 50% long-term homeowners. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would answer any questions.
Thank you, Director. Any questions for the Director? Representative Campbell.
I just want to clarify what I heard, because I'm kind of a simple fella. But this bill will express with clarity and in language that the counties can understand to be able to understand and execute the plethora of bills that we have out there, correct?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Campbell, it does clarify the order in which the math is applied. Now, when we get to those specific bills, we do have some functionality issues with the CAMA system for 2025, and I don't know if it's appropriate to speak to that. But this bill just basically states whatever bills, or excuse me, whatever exemptions are available for those properties, this is how you will apply the math. And the reason for a separate bill is so it applies. Could we have an instance where exemptions go away and we don't have multiple exemptions on one structure? That could happen, and then this is not necessary, but it doesn't need to be repealed. It would just be in place should that situation occur. And the other thing I should note is when we talk about level of assessment, that's not considered an exemption. So we do fair market value for all property, and then we apply the level of assessment. Right now, it's 9.5%, which basically tells the taxpayers of Wyoming, if you're in that all other category, that you only pay taxes on 9.5% of your fair market value. That's a level of assessment. That's not an exemption. It looks like an exemption, but it's not an exemption. Exemptions are specifically outlined in 3911-105 and are applied to that assessed value, which is taxable value, which is defined in Title 39 as well, which taxable value is defined as the assessed value after you apply the level of assessment to fair market value.
Thank you, Director. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Any other questions? Representative Wharf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the question that I have, Director Henson, and obviously, you know, we still got some in the pipeline. And the one I'm thinking of is House Bill 169 that this committee just passed. The question I have is on page 2, line 12, on double I, you talk about the exemptions based on percentages. The question I have is, that one's a 50% reduction like the other one. In the bill, we put an amendment that directed the department what that priority would be. This would not alter that, correct?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wharf, great question. So what the amendment was in House Bill 169 was that if the property owner qualified for the long-term homeowners exemption, the 50% exemption was not available. So there isn't, this bill in that instance would not be applicable because it's not available.
Okay, and that, Mr. Chairman, that's just what I wanted to make sure is that what we put in place stays in place and that this doesn't alter that, just so that this committee understands that. I appreciate you clarifying that, because that was, when you presented it, that was a concern I have. And I guess I don't know what other bills are in the pipeline, but if we have another bill, Mr. Chairman, that's at a 50% reduction that is in conflict, how do you see the department making a differentiation between exemptions that are maybe the exact same percentage? Maybe they're both at 50%. How would this help you determine that? Because I think we all agree we want this standardized, but that's a question I have, Mr. Chairman.
Director.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Wharf, a couple of great points that you made. So this language is only applicable if the exemption is available on that, if they qualify for the exemption on the property. But we had a discussion during House Bill 169, and this actually goes back to Representative Campbell's comment as well. Our current CAMA system is not capable of applying two percentages. I don't have two net value calculations. So what that means is in the current system, when you apply the 4% cap, and then you can apply the long-term homeowners, we're fine, because we're just applying it to a net after the 4%. But if there were another exemption in the middle of that, 50%, 25%, I don't have the functionality to calculate yet another cap for 2025. Future years, we can get that in the works. Now, what I will say is that if the two exemptions are on the exact same property, so for example, as these bills have been going through, some of them are just on the single-family residential structure. Some of them also include the associated residential land. Those are all things we're going to have to look at. But if, in fact, what passed through the body was a 50%, that is the same 50% that would be on the long-term homeowners, which would be the structure and the associated residential land. If we applied both of those, the math would be the same because they're the same percentages. So if we apply the 50% that was 169, and then another 50% to the net after that 50% on long-term homeowners, the math would be the same. It's only when those percentages are different, and that's why this bill's important, because it tells us go from the smallest percentage to the highest percentage and always apply it to the net in that calculation. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Director.
Thank you,
Representative
Director. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Oh, sorry, I thought he had a question. Representative Storer, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Locke. Good morning, Director Henson. So for this year only, though, with the 4% cap in place and the long-term homeowners in place, that should the body pass another exemption, percentage exemption, only one of those two, the long-term homeowners or the, like what's in House Bill 169 can actually apply to a single property, correct?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer, that is correct, in the CAMA system today.
Today.
And I think that was, if I can say, go ahead, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, as you said, we've got several property tax bills coming up. If acquisition value property tax bill passes, how will that affect this?
Director.
And how will that be applied?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, there's a lot of investigative work that has to be completed for the acquisition value study. This bill will go on the books and be there forever unless it's repealed. But certainly, part of the discussion with the acquisition value study is going back and looking at all of these other exemptions that were placed, along with Amendment A and the functionality and capabilities that empowered the legislature with. That's a much broader discussion. And the other piece of that is some of those exemptions may not even be in place based on sunsets. It's going to take years to implement an acquisition value-based system. So we'll have to cross that bridge when we get there.
Thank you, Director. And I think that this covers the exemptions, is really what it's trying to line out, these exemptions. So thank you. Any other questions? Representative Storer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps a question you can answer, or perhaps someone else in the room. So should any of these exemptions be found to be unconstitutional through the courts, what does that mean for going back and recognizing that they've been applied in the past, and what happens then for property tax for property owners if they didn't pay enough? Do we go back and ask them to pay that amount?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer, you're right. There are folks in the room, perhaps from the State Board of Equalization, that could respond to that. All I can tell you is historically, my experience has been that that if it went to the Supreme Court and we had a Supreme Court decision, that it is applicable at that time going forward, and that typically it doesn't claw back past years. Those were the laws on the books at the time, but I do believe the State Board could speak to that in a better manner.
Thank you, Director. Okay. Any other questions? Or
And Mr. Chairman, only one follow-up, just so the committee is familiar. The Department of Revenue has the responsibility of providing the computer system, mass appraisal system for all 23 county assessors. And by implementing this in place, we can ensure that that calculation is done in the same manner in all 23 counties. And we also provide training. And so we just appreciate this clarification, because I truly believe that if we don't clarify this, that a taxpayer could say, my long-term homeowner's exemption should apply to the full assessed value, even though I got the 4% cap and some of that has already been exempted. I really believe in reading the law, they could argue that. And this just clarifies that, no, that was not the intent, for you to receive the same exemption on the same property 2 times. So thank you.
thank you, Director. Right. So
So,
Representative Nicholas.
Mr. Chairman, my question to the Director of Department of Revenue is, does the CAMA system need to prepare or upgrade in order to take more information and have a different level calculation and be ready for that? And if so, depending on what the action of our legislature is, and do we need to safeguard it, do we need to start doing that now? And perhaps in in a bill or in this bill, provide the funds to do it?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Representative Nicholas. So currently with the CAMA system, the legislature provided funding for the Department of Revenue to take an our Oracle-based CAMA system and migrate to a SQL-based database, and also migrate to a cloud environment. We're right in the middle of that process as we speak. With our CAMA vendor, we were the last one of all their clients to still be on Oracle, so they're not doing any development there. However, once we get to SQL, that functionality will come once we finish with that conversion. Our scheduled timeline to finish up that project is to be done hopefully by November of this year, to have all of the counties converted to SQL and in a cloud environment. At that time, we would have the functionality to have another, what I call net value and a net value to apply another exemption to.
And just to
Thank you, Mr.
Just to
Representative
follow up
Nicholas,
on that,
please.
Mr. Chairman, if they're, depending on what happens and what we pass this session, we may need to have amendments that have implementation after November, if necessary.
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, so obviously everything is assessed and taxed as the laws are on January 1 of each assessment year. So definitely we have that at the Department of Revenue in the back of our mind, that whatever passes that may go into effect for 2026, we need to have that ready to go for 2026. I do think it's important that this body consider, if they're applying multiple large exemptions, that perhaps the language that's in House Bill 169 at least be considered. Because I do believe that a taxpayer, if they receive a 50% exemption in one exemption and a 50% long-term homeowners exemption, they would believe that they are 100% exempt. And the legislature needs to determine if that is your intent. And if not, put language in those bills that spell that out.
Thank you, Director. All right, thank you. Any other questions? Representative Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, was there, walk me through the thinking on choosing to apply the exemptions, starting with the smallest percentage and then moving on to the largest? Because I just did a couple of quick calculations, and it seems like the homeowner would be better off with largest to smallest.
Director.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lucas, I think the key there was that the smaller exemptions, those are not an exemption that need an application. Typically, those are simply a calculation by the county assessor. They look at this year's appraised value and then the assessed value, and they look at last year's value, and if it exceeds 4%, they apply it.
Okay.
The long-term homeowners, a little different situation, because you've got to apply for it and meet the criteria, and it's a larger percentage. I guess we really didn't consider what the percentages were when this was drafted. It was just a guideline to make sure it was uniformly applied. And so depending on what all the different percentages are, you certainly don't want a situation where the county assessor or the taxpayer can do the math and determine which order they're applied benefits them the most. Because you may be a property owner where the 4% doesn't apply to you.
Right.
Thank you, Director, and thank you so much. And anybody else like to speak on this bill? Thank you, Representative Nicholas, for bringing the bill. Appreciate that.
Mr. Chairman, Bill Winnie, Sublette County. Last summer, I knocked on a lot of doors around Sublette County and Lincoln County, a little bit of Uinta and a little bit of Sweetwater. And people are squeaking. And you've had a pulse already, and it just strikes me that something like California's Proposition 13 may be in the offing, may take a while. And so this kind of legislation is a good thing. I'd also note along the way that part of my knocking on doors, I visited the Greater Green River Intergalactic Spaceport. And it's really noted that way. Subject to questions, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winnie. Any questions? Great, thank you, sir. Anybody else want to speak on this one? Seeing none, we'll close public comment and committee. Representative Stivar moves the bill. Second. Representative Campbell seconds the bill. All right. All right, we'll go through very quickly. Any amendments? It's pretty much all on page 2, so we'll take a quick look. Any amendments? Great. Any discussion in the committee?
Question.
All right, seeing none. Donna, would you please call roll?
This is a roll call vote on House Bill 279, property tax exemptions, order of application. Representative Brown,
Aye.
Representative Campbell,
Aye.
Representative Lean,
Aye.
Representative Lucas,
Aye.
Representative Riggins excused, Representative Storer,
Aye.
Representative Stivar,
Aye.
Representative Worf left an absentee vote of aye. Chairman Locke.
Aye.
Chairman, we have 8 aye and 1 excused.
Okay. So House Bill 279 has passed House Revenue Committee. And at this point, since I'm the presenter of the next bill, I will relinquish the seat to Vice Chairman Stivar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quick on House Bill 282, how many people from the public want to speak on this? Raise a hand. How many county assessors want to speak on this? 1? All right, we need to keep this going, just give the facts, and that's all we need to hear. Go ahead, Chairman Locke. Present the bill.
Thank you, Chairman and committee. I appreciate the opportunity to present the bill. And get myself organized here. I will apologize for a little marble mouth. I got trying to keep from coughing too much. But we've been discussing property tax relief in many different forms, and actually that previous bill had a lot to do with property tax relief. But what this is, I would like to move us toward what I'd refer to as property tax reform. Okay? And so what I'd like to do is kind of summarize the bill, and maybe first I'll bring up a couple of important issues. You know, what is the issue? You know, everyone is currently being taxed on unrealized capital gains, in my view. And you know, you pay in advance for what you may or may not make sometime in the future on your home, and you're kind of gambling on hope, if you will. We hope we can sell at the high price that our house has been assessed at. And so that's really one of the big issues I see happening here. And that's where I think this bill has some potential to bring what I would refer to as property tax reform. And let me go just summarize the bill a little bit, because it'll help with going through the bill. It's a fairly long bill just because there's lots of places there's changes in the statute, but conceptually it's fairly simple. Okay, so just at the very highest level, it will apply to residential properties only, so it would be the new 4th category, basically, is what it would apply to. In the bill, we have a rollback to 2019. The concept here is we're dealing with a bubble. We're dealing with a bubble that has hit us in the last few years. Some may call it the COVID bubble, call it whatever bubble you'd like. But the long and the short of it is that the bill will then roll us back to a baseline of 2019. Next, there's an escalator built into this bill, and it's 2% or CPI, whichever is lower, is the escalator. And then ultimately, the objective is to start to roll actual acquisition value out in 2026. I'll go through a few more just high-level summaries of the bill, because what you're going to see, you're going to see the rollout, the rollback, and the rollout of the bill kind of happens in 3 phases. Okay, so the rollback to 2019, any house purchased before 2019, on or before 2019, you would be priced at the full market value of 2019. Any houses bought in the interim period between 2019 and 2026, your house, if your house was purchased in 2020 or 2021, your house would be brought back to the baseline in that year that it was purchased, and then you would begin moving forward. Now, in both of these cases, in that phase 1 and phase 2, you'd be rolled back to that baseline, and then as the escalator applies, the escalator would apply to your house moving forward. And then the third phase is moving to full acquisition value in 2026. There's a few more things to the bill. We've tried to put some things in here to make it simple to implement and much more simple to implement than some of the original concepts, but I will go over the bill now, and let's see if we can't walk through the bill. So I'll apologize, it is a long bill, but a lot of the information in here is, this statute is a big statute. The tax statutes are very big statutes, and so there's lots of places where language needs to be put in place just to allow implementation of this. So beginning on page 1, you can see it summarizes some of the sections that are changed. Moving to page 2, you can see several paragraphs within the tax code in the 3911-102. There's some changes, 3911-109, and so you'll see that 3913-103. So there's places where there's some language that has to be changed. Moving into 34 on page 2, looking at 34-142, the instrument of transferring title of real property, except as provided in section J of this section, the sworn statement shall be used by the county assessor. So one of the things we're trying to make sure we do in this bill is to make sure that the county assessor, so we're a non-disclosure state. So one of the key elements of implementing this is making sure that the right information, the right sworn statements are in place, and the right information is in place for the county assessors. Now, we're not changing from being a full disclosure state to where everything's out there, but we are trying to make sure that the processes and procedures to support the county clerks and assessors and all those involved in the process, the county and state boards of equalization, that this information is accurate and available to them to make sure we can implement this. And so what's happened is we've put in a new paragraph J. You'll see that on page 3, sworn statements regarding real property taxable under 3913-103 shall be available to the county assessors, county board of equalization, Department of Revenue, and the State Board of Equalization, because this data must be available to all of these organizations to make sure they can do what they need to do. Again, we're not going full disclosure. We're just making sure that what is typically disclosed to these entities is thorough and complete. Moving along, we're going to kind of get into as we move forward here. At the bottom of page 3, we're in 3911-101 into definitions, and I'm going to try to go through these fairly quickly, but when you get to page 4, you'll see fair market value, lines 7 through 9, fair market value of residential real property shall be determined as provided in Wyoming statute 3913-103. B, Romanet 18. And so you're going to see a few of these types of insertions in here. Moving down, we have attempted to implement in this particular legislation, we've implemented the new residential real property at 8.3%, provided that the value of the residential real property shall be determined as provided in 3913-103. So basically that 8.3%, the director, I think, previously mentioned that currently residential property is at 9.5%. Based on the Constitution and some of the statutes, the lowest that the residential property can be dropped down to is that 8.3%. So that's in this document. You'll see some conforming changes on the next page, on page 5. So we'll move fairly quickly. Really, it's just some paragraphs, changes that you see there. Then when you get down into 3911-102, you'll see that when you go down to lines 12 and 13, you'll see that there's an insertion of or other value required by law. So there are several locations in the statute where that is inserted just to allow acquisition value to be properly implemented. And you'll actually see that as you move forward to page 6, you'll see more of that other value required by law inserted in there. And I'll keep moving ahead. Go to page 8. So page 8, you'll actually see the beginning of this. You'll kind of see the beginning of this section 3911-102, and this is Administration of State Board of Equalization, and this kind of sprawls from page 6, 7, and 8. And and this change and the change on 8 and the change on 9 on page lines 8 through 10 on 9 basically are making some adjustments. It said this paragraph shall not apply to residential real property taxed under Wyoming statute 3913-103. Sorry about that. So this is making some adjustments to this section. And then, let's see here. And I know this is a lot of data. Sorry about that. We go down to page 9 at the bottom, okay? And there's some additional text in here as it relates to the appeals process. Paragraph B, Romanet 4 there. And you can see down there lines 20 through 23, the rebuttal presumption in favor of the valuation asserted by the department shall not apply to the extent the rebuttal presumption conflicts with 3913-103 B Romanet 18A3. And we're going to get to some of these sections. So sorry, these are just, a lot of this is conforming language. We get down here to the imposition on line, you'll see another line on page 10 where, or other value required by law. And then on the imposition section on page 11, we get down here into the basis of the tax. Again, there's some conforming language on line 9. We've made a change to Romanet 3 on line 16 where we've changed it from beginning on January 1 of 1989, we changed it to taxable value means a percent of the fair market value or other value required by law. Again, some conforming language. Here, paragraph C again, we're referencing the residential real property 8 and 3%. And we'll get to the main body of this document here shortly. Again, that extends to the top of page 12. Again, some conforming language on 12 and 13. Okay, and then we're going to move into sort of the meat of the document coming up here on page 14. So there's a lot to it. So if you get to page 14, again, there's some conforming language at the top. And you move down to lines 13 through 15. And you can see that's that Romanet 18 that we've been talking about. And here we talk about the following shall apply to the valuation of residential property as made subject to the taxation in paragraph 3C of this subsection. Now, beginning right there at line 17, we're going to get into the details of the project. Now, you remember I kind of mentioned that this implements kind of, I call it kind of in 3 phases, so I want this to be clear how we approach this. Beginning in January 1, 2026, the fair market value of residential real property shall be determined as follows. So this is, so Romanet, or not Romanet, Roman numeral I on page 14, line 21 through 23, and really it goes through the top of page 15. You'll see for any residential property that was last acquired on or before December 31st, 2019, the base year value of the residential property shall be equal to the fair market value of the property on January 1st, 2019. Now, so we're still applying fair market value at this point. The fair market value is what's currently in the CAMA system, okay? And so we're not applying necessarily, we're not changing what the county assessors have done at that time. At this point, we're just looking to roll back, trying to get to a better baseline that is, in my opinion, closer, getting people closer on to a value that makes sense. Then on Roman numeral 2, for any residential property that was last acquired on or after January 1st, 2020, and on or before December 31st, 2025, the base year for the residential property shall be equal to the fair market value on January 1st of the year the property was acquired. Okay? So again, if you bought in 2021, your baseline will go back to the January 1st date of the year you acquired it. Finally, Roman numeral 3, for any residential real property that was acquired on or after January 1st, 2026, there shall be a rebuttal presumption that acquisition value of the property is the fair market value of the property and shall be used as the base year for the property exemption as except as provided in subparagraphs 4 of this subparagraph. So let me talk to that. So the way this flows out, as I mentioned to you guys, there's the rollback to 2019, and anything on or before 2019 will be baselined in 2019. Everything from 2020 through 2025 will be baselined on their fair market value. So what the CAMA system currently has in there will be basically the baseline for those houses. And then in 2026, acquisition value would be applied. So moving on, so we talk about except as provided in subdivision 4 of the subparagraph. So let me talk about that. So we've got some potential cases where the fair market value may have to be calculated depending on what is imposed or based on the process. Now, most of your properties, as you all know, they're going through the title company. And so the acquisition value should be very, very well documented and should be supplied, I believe, to the clerks, and then ultimately is managed by the assessors, because I know that the clerks take the title information that comes from the title companies But moving down to the bottom of page 15, notwithstanding Division 3 of this subparagraph, for any residential property that was acquired on or after 2026, the fair market value of the property on January 1st of the year the property was acquired shall be used as the base value of property if. So here, under certain circumstances, if the, we're going to hit a couple of circumstances where fair market value may have to be used. So for example, a very high percentage of your properties are going to go through a normal title company process, okay? So acquisition value can be captured. What we've left room for here is a situation, so when you get to page 16, the presumption under subdivision 3 of this subparagraph, so I'm reading on lines 4 through lines 11, okay? The presumption under this subparagraph is rebutted by, so this is, let me read lines 1 and 2 at the top. Property was acquired shall be used as the base value of the property if, and we're talking about fair market value will be used, if the presumption under the subdivision 3 of the subparagraph is rebutted by a preponderance of evidence showing that the acquisition price paid to acquire the property was not fair market value. So it would be an unusual transaction, let's say, somebody gave their property to a friend or something. Hey, I'll give you my property for $100. That would be a situation where the assessor would probably have to develop a fair market value. The second case is if the new owner, and so we're talking paragraph 2, line 13 down there. The second case is if the owner of the residential property does not submit the information sufficient to establish the acquisition value. Okay? So that's basically the key points there. We've got the phase-in, and then we have these two cases where fair market value would be applied because the acquisition value, an accurate or a reasonable acquisition value was not available. All right? And then moving on, we're going to move on to paragraph B at the bottom. And the base year value, so as I mentioned, whatever year you bought it as a base year value, determined under the subparagraph A of the paragraph shall be adjusted as follows. The base year value shall be adjusted by an inflation factor that compounds annually, each year beginning on the first year after the base year. The value is determined under subparagraph A. The inflation factor shall be the lesser of 2% or the rate of the consumer price index. Okay, so this is the escalator that I'd mentioned. It's the lesser of 2% or the consumer price index. Then moving on to paragraph Roman numeral 2, the base year shall be adjusted as necessary to account for increases in the value of property caused by new construction or significant additions to a residential property. So you'll see in paragraph 2, there's a whole, that's a long paragraph. It goes from 17 through 18. And we talk about, so let's just say that you built on a significant addition, you doubled the size of your house. This goes through and gives instructions on how that would be handled. It would be based on construction costs and give some other parameters on what a significant addition would be. So if you finish your basement, that's not a significant addition. But, so this would be primarily focused on if you basically change the footprint of your house. You add it onto the footprint of your house. All right? And then we'll move ahead. There's let's see, paragraph C here. See, paragraph C at the bottom of 18. The amount determined pursuant to subparagraph C of this paragraph shall be fair market value of the residential property until the ownership of the property is transferred. So we're just making it clear There's no change in that fair market value until the owner of the property is transferred to a new person. Each time a residential property is transferred to a new person, the property shall be valued as provided in the paragraphs above. So again, when it's sold, acquisition value is what is used. And moving ahead, there's a lot of additional text in here. The property shall be subject to the inflation factors provided in subparagraph B. That's the escalator. As used in this paragraph, acquisition value as used in this subparagraph means the actual full amount paid to or to be paid to acquire residential real property. So here again, I would argue that fair market value, acquisition value is fair market value at time of purchase. The residential real property means, and I'm moving on to Roman I, so paragraph Roman numeral 2, lines 11 through 20. On page 19, you'll see there residential real property. There's a definition right there. And then you get down to Roman numeral 3. And now we're going to get into, this was my attempt to provide some guidance to the Department of Revenue on how to deal with what we will refer to in this document as transfers or acquisition of residential property. So transfer or acquisition of residential real property does not include, and so we have some transfer conditions. And I'm going to go through those. So for example, it's not a new acquisition value. You don't have a new acquisition value and you don't have to calculate a new fair market value if a transfer of property between spouses or between parents and their children. So what would happen in those cases, and we would look at all of these cases. Let me read them off and then I'll talk a little bit about how that would work. A transfer of property pursuant to a court order is another condition. A transfer of property to a trust established for the benefit of the prior owner. No point in that being a new acquisition value is not required for that. Transfer of property to a corporation, partnership, or limited liability company if the prior owner of the property is a shareholder of the corporation and partnership. And let's see, and finally, and then we have a donation. So I left in here a condition where a donation of your residential property to a religious or charitable organization, including nonprofit organizations. Here again, there would be no requirement for us to change the fair market value. And then finally, we left paragraph 6 at the top of page 21. We left paragraph 6 there in case it's a little bit vague, but we left some additional latitude on the department, for the department to, if there are other conditions of transfer of property. All right, so that is really the body of the document. So I know I've been through a lot of data here. And let's see, we go through, there's again, some conforming language on page 23, but again, nothing that significant. So I'm going to basically just hit a few key points and then I'll be ready for questions. But a couple of things I wanted to bring up, and I brought up a couple of these before. I want to readdress the issue. Everyone is currently being taxed on unrealized capital gains, in my opinion. Okay? And again, we hope we can recover those unrealized capital gains, but the truth is, with the current tax structure, they're taking your profits away before you even realize them. You're going to hear a lot of discussion on this. Everybody will tell you the current system is working great. Okay? Well, I would argue that this bubble has proven the current system doesn't work great. Okay? It's clearly not the case. The mere stacking of these exemptions is evidence that it is not working great. Okay? Acquisition value is fair market value at the time of purchase. So there's going to be a lot of discussion on fair market value. Absolutely. But if you think about it, Acquisition value should be fair, a good arm's length transaction, a fair market value. Acquisition value is that at time of purchase. There's going to be discussions about how it's unconstitutional, right? And so just reading Article 15, Section 11, all property except as in the Constitution otherwise provided shall be uniformly valued at its full value as defined by the legislature in the four classes, right? I would argue the property is definitely being valued consistently. Now, it's always interesting that term uniformly valued. So I would argue that that has a lot to do with that 9%, right? That 9% value. So for example, commercial is 9.5%, industrial is 11.5%. That is largely what drives the percentage of the value, and that's stated in Article 15:11. The legislature shall prescribe the percentage of value which shall be assessed within each designated class. All taxable property shall be valued at its full value as defined by the legislature. So I would argue this is definition of that. All taxation should be equal and uniform within each class and subclass of property. I believe this is equal and uniform, okay? We're picking that point where we're picking fair market value, that acquisition value at time of purchase, and we're applying a uniform approach to that value. Finally, there's going to be discussions on the rollback and how the rollback affects things. I want to explain the rollback a little bit, and this is why the rollback is kind of an important piece. It's kind of interesting when we do exemptions. Exemptions affect every county differently, okay? And so for example, if you put a 25% exemption, let's say you put a 25% exemption against the company or a county who their exemption has gone, or excuse me, their property taxes have gone up 100% in the last 4 or 5 years. Okay, you put a 25% exemption against that county. Someone could argue, I won't argue one way or the other, but someone would argue, hey, it hurts them less. Then let's take some of our poorer counties. Over the last 4 to 5 years, some of them have gone up 10%, between 8 and 10%, some of the lesser counties. Interestingly enough, if we take this rollback approach, for example, let's take the county that only went up 10%. If we roll back, everyone says, oh, well, we're rolling back to that 10%. Well, we're really not. Because what we're doing is we're going back to 2019, but then we're allowing an escalator on top of that money. Okay? And interestingly enough, that is a more fair application. The rollback is a more fair application than a straight up exemption, in my opinion, because it affects each county fairly from the perspective that if my county only went up 10%, I can only roll back. I'll roll back less. If my county went up 100%, I'll roll back more. And in all cases, the argument is, well, we don't want to roll back clear to that baseline. I agree, because the baseline, we go back to the baseline, but then we're going to apply the escalator on there. So we're not rolling back to 2019 values. What we're doing is going back to 2019 values and then allowing the escalator to increase the taxes. So those are some of the arguments that I would like to put out there against some of the things you'll hear. And I stand for questions, and I'm sorry I took so long.
Representative Campbell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative Locke. On page 19, line 15, we specify 35 acres. Is there any reason why 35, and is this consistent across the board with what we're doing?
Page 19, sorry. I know this, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Representative Locke?
Sorry. Representative Campbell. So this is some language that is already, this 35, let's see, this is some new text that was put in here. This is a number, this has been used on different occasions. We allowed I thought this particular text has been used on occasion for this definition. If 35 acres is something we want to adjust, we can look at that. I don't think that's really core to this bill, to be honest with you, if that needs to be adjusted. But the attempt here was to use some common language that has been used in the past in some of these bills. So it probably applies in that way. So, thank you.
Representative Storr?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Chairman Locke, I appreciate the diligence of your efforts here. A couple of questions. The complications of the calculations that this bill, implementing this bill, would require, I think, will not be very transparent to the public, and rather difficult. I don't think, based on your explanation, anyone in this room actually understands what this bill will do exactly. And I guess more to the point is looking at the fiscal note, and I can do a quick calculation, but we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of taxes that would be, that would not be taxed. So what are you thinking about how we make up for those losses of taxes for schools and local governments? What's the solution there?
Representative Locke?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Storr. So let me talk a little bit to that. So the real issue to the change. So first let me explain, maybe I didn't explain well enough. Let me explain, the calculation is not a complicated one. It's an arm's length transaction acquisition value. So it's the value you paid for the home. So the calculation is not complex. The fair market value components of this to move us forward absolutely are the same of the way they calculate them now. So the calculations are very simple, to be honest with you. In fact, I would argue that acquisition value is far simpler. How much did you pay for the house, and was it an arm's length transaction? That's about as simple as it gets in terms of this. So I would argue at least that piece of it is not complex. And moving forward, the biggest issue we have is just making sure that the processes for capturing acquisition value are robustly deployed. And we leave room for the department to make sure they promulgate the rules, capture that data. And again, we don't really change the full disclosure component, but we do, the goal of this bill and some of the sections in this bill were designed to help improve that and give the department room to promulgate some rules to make that process robust. So that's the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question in terms of the impact. So the impact is simply the rollback, is the impact to the value. Because conceptually, when you buy your house, well, let me just talk to the rollback. So the rollback, for example, I rolled back to 2019 in this bill the way it currently states. And that's where you'll see a fiscal note in here that estimates it, I think, at about $260 million, okay? And that particular rollback amount is because in 2019, and I may not have these numbers exactly in my head, I probably have them on my confuser, but in 2019, the property tax collected, the residential property tax collected across the state was about $380-some million, okay? The property tax collected across the entire state in 2024 is $652 million. Okay, so if that gives you a feel, it's just, a little bit short of, of doubling in that same time window. So that amount of money that is talked about in terms of, on the fiscal note, that's where it's coming from. So the part of the point of this bill is us readjusting because of the bubble, okay? So a big portion of this is adjusting that bubble on as equal an approach as we could possibly implement. And so hopefully that helps a little bit. Now, are there other things that could be considered? There are other things that could be considered. For example, is there value in backfilling, having a backfill to level that off? That's certainly an additional discussion that could be held. And then, of course, Representative Storr, you probably know the mechanisms as well as anybody, all of the different ways we could approach it. But a big portion of this is adjusting for a bubble that has adversely affected our folks. And this is an approach to reform, in my opinion. Thank you.
Follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Chairman Locke. So thinking about what's happened over the last few years, we do know that the biggest property tax increases have come in the northwest part of the state, from where I'm from. And these are also the highest values for property, and they also saw the highest percentage increase. So I think when you look at that, if you dial back properties, especially in Teton County, you're looking at reducing to 2019, you're looking at a 50% reduction in the tax, in the value of those homes. So let's say a home that was is now worth $20 million would roll back to about $10 million, I think, with this bill. And so you're giving the biggest tax breaks to the wealthiest people who own property in the state. And I believe this bill would also apply to not just owner-occupied homes, but second homes as well. So we're giving a bunch of wealthy people in Teton County the biggest tax breaks with this bill. Would you agree with that?
Chairman, Representative Storr, the argument that I would make is that this approach is an attempt to do it uniformly and equally. And so those properties are more expensive. They probably escalated significantly more. Your statement very well may be accurate, but at the end of the day, I think in an attempt to be uniform, apply this uniformly across the state, this does that. And again, so I don't really, the argument of, oh, well, it helps these people more. Well, I believe it's a uniform application of this process across the entire state.
All right, Director? All right, let's bring the county assessor up. Who's going to speak? Please come up, state your name. Please state your name and where you're from.
Good morning, members of the committee. My name is Marty Hartzog. I'm chairman of the Board of Equalization. Also with me here is the board member, Jane Mockler, who I think most of you probably are familiar with. And then holding down the fort back at the Board of Equalization is David Delacath. It's my pleasure to be here. And I had to tell you, I've been working with the state for 25 years, and I have been in front of committees many times and assisted advised. I used to be in the Attorney General's office for 17 years, and I mainly in the tax realm, but kind of across the board. And then Governor Meade invited me to take the job with the Board of Equalization because I have an extensive background in mineral taxation, which is quite it's a primarily challenge of the Board of Equalization to resolve those cases. I want to give you my sense on behalf of the board about this bill, and I think Chairman Locke did a wonderful job of kind of previewing some of the pushback that you're going to hear from me, and I suspect others. But I think it's important to first understand what the Board of Equalization is and how far back it goes. It goes back to at least 1869, long before the state was a state. I've done extensive research and actually trained assessors and worked with the state bar. I am an attorney. To educate them about the tax system. And so the Board of Equalization actually was one of the largest agencies in the state, made up of the governor, territorial auditor, and territorial treasurer. And that continued to be the case until 1919. And at that point, the board did many, many things. Department of Transportation, all the licensing of occupations. And the Board of Equalization was huge. Did all the Department of basically revenue collection. And so you can imagine that over time, as the state grew and the need for additional agencies came online, the Board of Equalization was whittled down to basically just tax stuff, tax court and equalization. Because this bill so directly impacts the board, I'm going to focus mainly on the constitutional part of it.
Thank you, sir. We just want to move
Yeah,
this along. so
I will be
go on.
direct and I will dispense with any of the equivocation. So what happens is the board becomes an agency, and it's responsible under the Constitution to ensure uniformity of taxation as well as a tie to market value. Now, initially, it did a whole bunch, but now it's just one sentence. It's in Article 15, Section 10. It simply says, the board shall equalize valuation across the counties. That's what it does. And so that brings me, and understand I've been reviewing the convention, and this is what I think is somewhat missing from the chairman's presentation, is the idea of taxable value as well as uniformity was so much in the front of the thinking of all the convention delegates back in 1889. I've read through them, and when you do, you will see time and time and time again, we don't care exactly how much you tax, but by God, everybody better be paying tax on a uniform basis. That comes up time and time and time again. And there are quite a few mentions of what value is, and it's market value, full value, fair market value. So that's all right in the Constitution. As Chairman Locke mentioned, Article 15, Section 11 is the provision that says that assessments will be based on a full value, and then farther down in Section D, it says, and taxations shall be uniform, fair, and equal. Taxation, not value. So, I mean, you have to almost jump out of the value realm and look at the overall impact. And it puts the duty, the responsibility on the legislature to pass regulations to ensure this. That's in Article 15, Section 11. I'm going to move this as quickly as I can. So getting into the bill, and I hate to say this, but I really feel I'm compelled to, because I'm not going to tap dance with this. This bill, at least in part, is on its face unconstitutional. On its face. That means day one, if it's enacted, the Board of Equalization, assuming the governor would allow it to, would literally have to sue the state legislature to challenge this bill in one respect. And there's two parts that are really a problem. The first one, and I'll just move you to the part that discusses the board's authority under 39-11-102.1. It's on pages 8 and 9. So I mentioned to you, and I'm going to tie this in, the Constitution at Article 15, Section 10 says, it shall be the duty of the board to equalize, basically to ensure uniformity. That's what it says. That is its only constitutional function. that stems all the way back to 1869. So you can see it trace right through to the present. If you look at the language added on to subparagraph 2 and subparagraph 3 under the board's authority, what it said, and understand these two provisions, I'll just really summarize. This is the process of equalization right here. 2 and 3 is where it says the board shall, it's the process, which is grounded squarely in the Constitution, okay? And the language in this bill says, the paragraph shall not apply to residential real property taxable under the new provision, the new acquisition cost approach. So basically what it's saying is the board's not going to perform its constitutional function with respect to an acquisition cost. Now, I can tell you, you can look at it different ways and say, well, it just says you won't apply these provisions, but these are the constitutional mandates right here. This is the mass appraisal analysis that the board applies every year through a statistician. And so for the statute to literally say, the board, you're not going to do it, is like saying that constitutional provision that gives you your function doesn't apply, which the statute, of course, cannot do. It just can't. If you want to adjust the board's of equalization's authority and give it, direct it that it's not going to equalize or ensure uniformity, you'd have to go to the Constitution and change it. So, it doesn't go away simply because you put it in a statute. Now, I'm going to repeat, that's on its face unconstitutional. You could argue, well, it's just of adjusting the statutory language, but in effect, the board cannot not perform its uniformity and equalization function. The second, and this is a little more nuanced, I'm going to go fast. The notion that you can simply say full value now equals whatever the purchaser paid for the property and escalate it each year is absolutely contrary to what the notion of market value, full value, and it certainly doesn't align with what the founders, again, in 1889, September of 1889, when the convention got together, that's not the way they would have understood it. And understand, when we talk about a bill that adjusts and redefines market value, we're not going to go back to what the legislature thinks. We have to go back to what the delegates of the counties in 1889 thought. That's the arbiter. You have to square your statutes with the Constitution, and whatever they thought fair market value was, or full value, is the law. Now, it does say as defined by the legislature, but understand, that does not give the legislature license to simply abandon concepts that were core in the thinking of the constitutional delegates. There's an analogy here, members of the board. When years ago, about 15 years ago, you might recall the legislature got crosswise with the superintendent of public construction. The superintendent was at odds, and the legislature passed a massive bill that basically gutted much of the superintendent's authority. The Constitution said, as defined by the legislature, said the duties of the superintendent as defined by the legislature. And so the legislature did that, redefined the superintendent's authority and said, you don't have these functions anymore. The superintendent sued, went all the way up, and she prevailed, because what happened was the legislature decided that it could get rid of basic functions of the superintendent intended by the founders. So it didn't matter that the language said, as the legislature defines. There's a limit there. It's got to stay true to whatever the founders understood that authority to be. So when we look at the next part, which I think is more of an as-applied unconstitutionality, and this is something I've testified to before, the notion of a acquisition cost value is not new. I was here last year and the year before and the year before. We interim committee hearings. This is an idea that's come up, and we've gently pushed back and said, look, if you want to do this, you have to do what California did and change the Constitution. Proposition 13 is exactly was done the right way. They put it on the ballot, and the people in California said, yeah, let's go with acquisition cost. You can't do that in Wyoming simply by statute, because the statutes, the Constitution expects market value, and you can't simply say, well, market value is now going to be whatever the person paid for it. The second part that's even more difficult to reconcile is that uniformity part. Now, I was here last year on the 4% cap, and the legislature members said, this is just a step around or a way to sidestep that full value point. We're going to do it. And I said, that's going to be a problem if we ever talk about uniformity, and it already is. I think it's just a matter of time before we see a challenge. But when it happens, we'll have it in front of a court. But this right here so differentiates market values across property taxpayers. Uniform, equal, all of those concepts would have to be reevaluated under a lexicon that, quite honestly, did not exist in 1889. And so I believe that if this bill were to be passed, the board or somebody would have to pursue litigation, and both the facial unconstitutionality of it as well as the as applied would quickly become a point before the court. There is no question at all that uniformity is not achieved as the founders in 1889. I understand that. It all ties back to that. You can't use today's notion of uniformity. You have to go back to the Constitution. That's exactly what you're weighing every constitutional argument against. What did the founders in 1889 think? I can tell you right now that the uniformity, and it was foremost on their thinking. Members of the board, members of the committee, I think you would be astounded how uptight they were when it came to that. So, in sum, if you want to pass a bill of this nature, you really have to go to the Constitution and change it to allow this kind of change. If you want to remove the Board of Equalization's authority and have it not apply to this kind of valuation approach, you have to change its authority. And you'd have to address both the full value concept under Section 11 of Article 15, as well as D, which says taxation, not value. Taxation shall be fair, uniform. Taxation, that means the outcome. So I stand for questions. I apologize if that was more direct or forward than you would like, but that's the way it is.
Questions? I got a question, and just off the top of my head. Isn't being taxed on capital gains that you ain't seeing unconstitutional? Isn't that wrong, sir?
Representative Steyer, co-chair, absolutely not. That's more of an income tax concept. When you're talking full market value, you're not talking in terms of capital gains. You're speaking in terms of what the market demand for a property is. What would a willing buyer purchase and a willing seller sell a property for after exposure to the market in an arm's length arrangement? Try to disabuse yourself of the idea that income tax concepts weave their way into property tax. They just don't. So I think that's the long and short of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee, Mr. Chairman, my name is Dixie Huxtable. I'm the Converse County Assessor, and today I'm here with the Assessors Association approval, and I do have other assessors in the back. If there's additional questions that maybe they could answer, they'd be happy to step forward. First of all, I'm not here to tell you whether acquisition is right, wrong, good, or bad. What I'm here to do, to tell you today, is the administration issues we have with this bill. The policy change of how you want to change the methodology is not up to us. We just administer it. So I want to start today with the reporting of the sales, because this is basically starting with the sales price, as the bringer of the bill suggested. Currently, there is a statement of consideration that is required to be filed when a deed is filed at the clerk's office. That statement of consideration has certain parts that are required and other parts that are optional at the discretion of the person that files it. So currently, we, the assessors, have a terrible time getting all those statement of considerations complete. I'm just giving you the facts of how it is now. It's not the clerk's responsibility to verify that that information is accurate or complete per the State Board of Equalization rules who developed that form. It's our job, the county assessors. And I repeatedly, in my county, personal experience, have trouble getting those forms completed with buyer, seller information. We are required to review and confirm all the data that's on those forms, the sales prices, the financing, time of sale, all those kinds of things. And we have a terrible time currently, when those sales are just being used now in the analysis of the values. I can't imagine how that will transpose into what we will get once they know that that statement of consideration is going to set their value forever as long as they own it. Remembering there is no requirement that they use a realtor, a title company in Wyoming. So we get many statements of considerations where the buyer or the seller fills them out themselves and just don't complete it. And we struggle to get that information. The other thing that I want to talk about the sales is typically when you fill one of those forms out, if you've ever had to fill one out, you put a sales price. That sales price includes all the assets that you purchase, land, improvements, and possibly personal property if it was included. Our Constitution requires us to value land and improvements separately. There is no current way for that statement of consideration to split that out unless we get a chance to talk to those people and verify it. And as I just stated, that's a problem now. I think it would be even worse moving forward. And I don't know how you would get that sales price broke down between the land and the improvement. That would be some work on the State Board of Equalization because it's their form. The other side of this sales reporting is multiple properties that are sold in one sale. There's one sales price that involves multiple properties. The allocation of that sales price would be a problem for us to administer. There currently is not a good way to allocate that, and specifically think about your ag land sales. Agricultural land is not based at fair market value according to our laws currently. It's based on production value. But every ranch that sells that has a house, that house is included in that sales price, and there is no breakdown. And yet we would be required to come up with an acquisition value from that sales price to assign to that residential house. At least that's how I'm reading the bill. If I'm misinterpreting, please help me figure that out, because that's how I'm reading that. On page 3 of the bill, it talks about the sworn statements, which is the statement of consideration I believe that I'm referring to. And it says it does not waive the requirements. I would just make a statement that after 2026, if you're using that acquisition price to set the value, confidentiality has just kind of went out the window because everybody's going to know what that's sold for. So while we would keep those statements confidential, after 2026, if this bill was to pass as it is now, those new purchase prices are, those new properties are based off of their purchase price. I did want to comment as well about the State Board of Equalization, but I'll let that go because I believe Mr. Hartzog covered that adequately, and I don't want to go over that again, although we do have the concerns on page 8 where it says this paragraph shall not apply. If you notice on line 10 of that page, it says the State Board of Equalization shall certify the valuation to be used for all tax levies on or before the first Monday of August. If you're removing that paragraph, I'm not sure when and how they will certify the residential values. So that's a logistic thing that needs to be worked out with this bill. Moving on, there are, on page 9, there is reference to the department, rebuttable presumption in favor of evaluation asserted by the department. I'm not sure if that was supposed to be the department, because I believe we're talking about the county assessor. These are appeals, unless they're really referring to the Department of Revenue is typically not valuing residential properties. And before we leave the total deal with the statement of considerations and the sales prices, when we get further into the bill, I've heard this comment about the 35 acres. I don't know how we would allocate a part of that price to the house and 35 acres if it was a 600-acre parcel that got sold, whether it was agricultural or not. I'm not sure how we would be able to come up with a process to do that. So that's something that would need to be considered before this was put into place. The next biggest issue for the assessors is the uniformity. We talked about, you talked about it being uniform for the acquisition values being uniform. And for those properties that sell, that very well may be true. But I have two statistics from two counties. I hadn't gotten everybody across the state, but from my county, I process about 500 documents a year. Of those, less than 200 are valid residential sales. I have a little under 5,000 residential properties in my county. So I'm going to have 180 to 190 sales that maybe that will reflect the actual sales price in the future, but the rest of them have to be valued somehow. Fair market value is what we have, and that I understand that's the intent of this bill, but you're going to have some uniformity. You could have a house, two houses, identical characteristics sitting side by side. They're going to have different values and different taxes, one because it sold recently and one because it's been owned for several years, and we're going to theoretically roll back to 2019 and add some escalators. To us, that's not uniform and consistent, not within the residential class. Fremont County, I got their numbers just as and they're a much bigger county than I am. They have roughly 18,000 residential properties with residential structures. They process over 2,700 deeds a year, but only 375 are what are considered valid arm's length transactions. So when you start talking about this, the actual true acquisition is a very small percentage of all the property that we have to value. And we need to be sure that we can administer this and be fair and equitable to all. Which brings me to page 14 and on into the rest of it, where you're going back to 2019. We have some serious concerns of how we're going to do that when the property is not the same characteristics now in 2026, when this goes into effect, as it was in 2019. We are required to field check every property within once every 6 years. That means we will have been to those properties since 2019 and picked up the changes. So if we start with 2019, then we have to find out the cost, as I read this, of every change that we've made to that property. Now, I understand that there's some definition of changes, significant changes, but what do we do with the rest of them that we had picked up in between? Do we ignore those and go back to the 2019? Or are we using the current value with all those changes and then starting that as the base value? I just need some clarification on how that's going to work. I have numerous properties in my county where in 2019 it was owned by a private individual, a residential. They moved it into a trust or a corporation, and then they split it. So the characteristics are not even close to the same back then, and there was no acquisition involved. It's just a split. Or maybe a new person built a house and there's no acquisition. So we have to make sure that we have enough guidance in this bill, if this was to pass, for us to do it uniformly across the board and treat everybody fair. I would suggest that on page 17, it references that the department shall adopt rules specifying the construction costs, how they're determined. And then it goes into saying something about actual costs may be submitted. I would strongly encourage you to, if you're going to leave it in the hands of the department, leave it in the hands of the department. To have a taxpayer be able to walk into my office with their receipts and say, this is what I paid for my house because I built it myself, and the guy next to him doesn't have those receipts, so we're going to use the department's prescribed cost methods, doesn't seem very fair and equitable to me. I think we need to stay consistent with that. Certainly, if they want to appeal that cost table and how that cost is approached, they have that ability. Nobody's taken that away from them in this bill. But I would really strongly recommend that if you're going to go with the department having the prescribed manuals and cost tables, that we stay that way. And then on page 18, you talk about that it's going to stay with that acquisition value as previously stated in the previous paragraphs, until the ownership of the property is transferred to a new person. So I need some clarification, and I know that they've talked in here what is not a transfer, but what do we do with that value? Do we just keep it the same as when they originally purchased it, even if they split it, or they've taken on new owners, or added new assets to it? We need some clarification on how that's going to work. Page 19 defines residential real property. I too have the problem with the 35 acres when you're defining the residential property. I understand that this language may have came from some of the exemption language that's out there when you're trying to do an exemption for a certain amount of assets. But for me to determine that that sale was 50 acres and a house, and now I have to treat 15 of the acres differently than I do 35 is a problem. So I think when you're defining residential real property, the 35 acres becomes a stumbling block. I'm not sure what the answer would be, if it would just be associated land, but certainly it adds complications to the whole process. I guess the biggest thing I want to state is that there's a significant amount of issues that we have with this bill that's drafted. It needs some significant work. Some probably could be done with amendments. Some need some serious thought process put in. Irregardless, and I'm not talking on behalf of the State Board of Equalization, which I absolutely support their statement and their concern. We believe it's unconstitutional, along with being not uniform and equal across the board. So if you really feel that you want to do a project like this, I really would encourage an interim study where we can do the steps in a manner that can be implemented across the state uniformly and fairly, and not be picking winners and losers if that's the language that I've heard in some of the cases. We want to work collectively with the legislature, and we hear the complaints from the taxpayer across our counters every day. And so we know there's a problem out there. And if I tried to explain what the sponsor of the bill did to my taxpayers across the counter, I'd lose them pretty quickly. I think I would lose them if I used my technical terms pretty quickly. So we've got to do this in a manner that the taxpayer can understand that they're being treated fair and equitably. And please understand that when you're going to acquisition, that may be very well for those properties that sell, but we don't sell the majority of the properties in Wyoming. The majority of the properties in Wyoming are either built, handed, gifted, or they've had them forever. And so there are a lot of properties out there that we have to figure out how we're going to treat them fairly in both valuation and taxation. I would stand for any questions that anyone would have.
Questions, committee? I have one.
Certainly.
Thinking about it, is somebody buys their house and, 10, 20 years, they decide to refinance it at a higher value. Will that affect the acquisition costs?
Mr. Vice Chair, I'm not sure I understand that because we don't have any part of refinancing. So unless they transfer or it sells, we would not know any of those details. So as I understand it, based on this, once it's sold after 2026, that value would stay until it had a valid arm's length sale again, with no kind of escalator or adjustment other than if there was some significant changes as described in the bill. I would point out one thing as we talk about values and how they change. As a reminder, we have statistical analysis that we have to pass with the Department of Revenue and with the State Board of Equalization. And we are looking at a medium ratio, which means our median, the middle, not the average, but the middle ratio, which means you're going to have some above and some below. We need to be between 95 and 105% of the sales price. So when we put in those sales and the State Board of Equalization does their analysis on us, we have to fall within that range to stay compliant. What that means is there's going to be some above us and some below us. So if you're going to acquisition, while there will be some that come down, there will be some that go up because we aren't putting them at their full market value potentially unless that falls within the range. So I just want to make sure you understand that an acquisition range doesn't mean everybody comes down. There will be some that have an increase in value.
Thank you. No more questions. Let's open up to the public. Please take a seat, state your name, where you're from. Thank you for coming today.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Board, Alan Slagle from Weston County. I really think this bill is a good step. I mean, I've been across the state, I see a lot of people are concerned about their taxes going up, and they haven't sold their homes. They've been living in it maybe their whole lifetime. And there's a lot of, especially our seniors in some of the western counties of the state, they're about to lose their homes just because the value's gone up so much and they're on a fixed income. So I think this is a good way to do it. And I know there's been concerns about the uniformity and fair tax value and fair market value and all these things. But as I look at it, the way I see it, it's uniform if we tax people the same, even though they've bought their homes at different prices. So, I mean, it doesn't matter if I buy a Lamborghini or my neighbor buys a Volkswagen, we still get taxed at 9.5% on that purchase. And I think that's, in my mind, that's uniform. Even though we might have a little bit of difference, it's what we pay for it, it's what we're taxed on, not the actual market value. I'm not sure that's the fairest way to do these. And so anyway, I think it's a good bill. I do have some concerns on page 17 where it's talking about improvements. My thoughts on improvements are, and I've heard this in the past, somebody buys their land, they go in and clean it up, our assessors come by and all of a sudden, oh, your land looks pretty now. The value just gone up on it, even though you haven't sold it, you've just made it look prettier. And so I think looking at improvements on a house, most of the time, if we're improving especially our house, we've paid sales tax on all the materials, maybe paid sales tax if we had a contractor come in and work for us. And so they've added all that value to our house. But at the same time, we really haven't realized that extra added value until the time we sell that property. And so I think this should go along with the whole acquisition idea that we don't increase the value of the property until it's sold. Because we've already paid tax on all the inputs coming into it for the most part, unless you can magically manufacture them yourself with no cost. And so that would be my one concern about this bill as it is currently. But otherwise, I stand for it. I think it's a good bill. Any questions?
Any questions for Representative Slagle? You, sir?
Mark Jennings. This used to be one of my home committees, served on it. So thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman and Mr. Chairman, for all the work that you've done on this concept and committee. I appreciate you taking this up and looking at it. While I work for Honor Wyoming sometimes, this is me speaking for myself, having a vested interest in having done this idea or this concept for at least the last 4 to 5 years. And so I'd like to bring up 2 or 3 things, if I could, Mr. Vice Chair. And to give you the history of this was a concept started probably about 5 years ago, and then it was brought forward. And 4 years ago, we knew we didn't have the votes, and about 3 years ago, turned it into a study. And the main reason that we turned it into a study bill was to see what the opposition was going to come back with and how we could improve that, what things we might have to stand against, and what things we actually really needed to change. And I really want to compliment the chairman and all the hard work. I know he's worked with a number of you and the departments and people that are willing to talk about it. So the current system is based upon coming out of Prop 13. And there's very few things that I'd want Wyoming to copy from California. But this is one that's kind of an interesting one to me, because every common person that I've talked to that moved here from California, I've yet to talk to a single one that was against Prop 13. They've tried everything you can imagine to get rid of acquisition, and it seems very interesting to me that Prop 13 is hated by the liberal politicians and the bureaucrats. And that makes it kind of an interesting. I like the fact that the good chairman has made this acquisition tailored to Wyoming. We don't have 40 million people to take care of. We have a little over 500,000. And so clearly it's going to be tailored differently. And that's up to you as the committee for the policy decisions of how you would implement this. I wanted to reiterate, I heard it said by Ms. Huxtable, and I want to reiterate that the current system not only averages, say, cheaper houses up to the higher value, which is why we're here with this, but it also does the opposite of that. It averages the higher. Somebody comes in with a $20 million house and they're living in a neighborhood that where houses are valued lower, so it actually averages that down also. So they're correct that there will be people that it will save money, but it will also cost some people some money. That's true in the current system. And in the current system, the people at the lower end of that spectrum are being taxed higher on an unrealized capital gains, and the people at the higher level are actually getting a tax break because they're being valued with houses that are lower. Now, another point that I'd like to point out to you is we've had a lot of exemptions, and I think the word plethora, which I like very well, is a plethora of exemptions. And if I could, I'd just read to you from Article 3, Section 27. One of the things about special law, and that's prohibited in our Constitution, is exempting property from taxation. I would argue that there's constitutional issue with the plethora of exemptions that are out there. Now, they haven't been challenged, and clearly I'm for some temporary relief and would have voted for them and waited for the constitutional challenge, which we haven't seen yet. But exemptions are a methodology of picking winners and losers. This brings more uniformity. I would totally disagree with the Board of Equalization's legal analysis to this. If this passes, and this is real reform, you should begin looking at unwinding those exemptions. That also would alleviate some of the need for the Representative Store's question about how do we make this up? Well, maybe we shouldn't be picking winners and losers, and maybe the overall picture should be that everyone gets a fair shake at this. And the other thing that I would point out too is the process today. The Board of Equalization said you have to go back and look at how our state was founded. Well, the process is today is not the same as it was at the founding. We've gone through this current mechanism of fair market value is about 34, 37 years old. It changed, and the legislature changed that. And so, and I think it has changed a couple of times in between that. In fact, I think there's a bill coming that would go back to what we had, and I don't know what it will pass or do anything, but goes back to a cost basis minus depreciation. Was that a better system? Could be. But to think that we have to go back and base everything on 1889, maybe there's a place where we will have to do a constitutional amendment. Maybe that is a place, and maybe something that we have to think about. I don't see that in current legislation, and I don't see it in the Constitution that there haven't been changes and that you get to make policy decisions. So with that, I'm in favor of this and would stand for any questions, Mr. Vice Chair.
Any questions, committee? Thank you, Mr. Jennings. Representative?
Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman. Jim Willix, Commerce County Commissioner, and I'm here representing myself and thoughts I've heard from other people in my 18 years as a county commissioner in Converse County, and some of the questions that have been raised. Fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed the discussion because property taxes is an important discussion right now, and I believe this is not the answer to the property tax issues that are in front of us. Contrary to the prior speaker, most anything out of California I would not subscribe to, and I think most local governments would say in California it's been a failure because of the decrease to revenue. What this bill does, in my opinion, is not, taxes are a method of collecting funds for government to provide services that people demand and want. We use tax revenue to provide police, fire, customer service at the counter, IT support, salaries, health insurance. If you go backwards to 19, even with the inflator, the cost of providing services has gone up more than 10% since 2019. So if you believe that you should pay for the services you're receiving, you're not keeping up with the costs. Electricity has gone up, health insurance has gone up. A road grader that used to cost $325,000 now costs $500,000 plus to maintain the same amount of roads that we had in 2019. A mile of road used to be $1 million a mile. That was our factor. We'd say $1 million will do a paved road. $1 million doesn't get you a paved road anymore. A patrol car, ammo, all of those cost more than they did, and never in my 18 years, with maybe one exception, COVID upset thing, have we not seen the cost of everything go up more than 2%. So we are going to widen the gap over time between the cost of providing services that our constituents demand and want and the revenue that we are receiving to provide that. A house that doesn't change in value doesn't deserve less services, but the cost to provide them go up. It's the nature of things. And so we're not, market value at least reflects that the overall environment goes up, and generally speaking, the cost of providing services in that environment has some relationship. As the price of your home goes up, the services and goods, there's generally a correlation, and they go down sometimes. And we've seen, unfortunately, most time what goes up in providing services doesn't go down. The other thing I would like to note is a lot of special districts and counties and cities are at their max mills. So this compounds between the cut of about 12% in the ratio from 9.5 to 8.3, the inflation factor and the cost. I think it's about a 50% net decrease in the ability to provide the same services. There's a fire district in the southwest part of the state that says he's at his max mills and he saves 8 years. Takes him 8 years of savings to get a fire truck, and he has multiple fire trucks he needs. He can't raise his mills, and this bill and other property tax relief bills will make that now a 12-year or more longer form. I'm not sure that's providing the services our public wants. The other thing, we have a housing problem in Wyoming. We all know that. This incentivizes people not to sell, because if they trade up, their property taxes go up. So part of their calculation will be, I will remain in this house at a lower property tax value, which compounds the problem we have with churn and makes it harder for people to get into homes. Now, all of that is theoretical. All of that is part of this great discussion. The chairman laid out some very good discussion points for it. I do believe it needs some more work, but I really am glad we're having the conversation because it's valuable. Representative Stornar had this conversation a few months ago about the property tax relief and how to approach it. I don't think this is the right bill, but I believe it's the right conversation. And so, Mr. Vice Chair, I'd stand for any questions if there are any.
Representative Lane?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming today, Mr. Wilcox. I just want to ask one question. I'm not sure if you're aware, has your county sold more than 10% of its homes since 2019?
Unfortunately, my county assessor was just up here, so her data is accurate. Whatever she said, I agree with on the data.
Okay.
I'm on the record, sorry. I don't know that answer, but Dixie is our Converse County assessor.
Mr. Chairman, may I follow up?
Follow up.
Thank you. The reason I ask is because if you're talking about costs going up more than 10%, but residential properties, more than 10% of them have been sold, would it therefore be a balance in cost adjustment because the new home will be paying more property tax versus the home that was adjusted to the 2019 value?
Mr. Vice Chair, I apologize for not going through you the last time.
It's all right, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. No, I don't think the math works because the new acquisition value generally represents the cost of providing services today. At that time, it's an acquisition. So if only 10% do, that means that 10% is paying what it costs today to provide services, and the other 90% are behind. So it reduces the width of the gap, but it doesn't close the gap by any means. It just keeps shifting along. You're always going to be behind because anybody that keeps their house is paying less than the cost of the services to be provided. In general, and I can always find exceptions, and so can you, but that would be the correlation I would see.
No more questions?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Oh, I'm sorry.
No more questions? We will
Thank you.
close public comment and, got one more. Need to get this, keep this moving.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity. Pete Obermueller. I'm the president of the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. Mr. Vice Chairman, it's the first time I've had the opportunity to present in front of this committee. Some of you I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, and look forward to doing so. Mr. Chairman, the Petroleum Association of Wyoming represents the entire gamut of the oil and gas industry in Wyoming, from exploration and production to pipelines and downstream refineries, and everybody who helps make the industry go in Wyoming. Environmental consultants, engineers, geologists, et cetera. Mr. Chairman, this is an important issue to us, and would ask, as you consider it, that you think holistically about it, not just about the implications, of course, to residential taxation, but to how Wyoming's taxation works overall and how that ends up affecting the oil and gas industry. So, Mr. Chairman, in 2023, which is the most recent data, we'll have updated data here in a couple of months, your oil and gas industry paid $2.42 billion in taxes to the state of Wyoming. $2.42 billion in taxes. You'll talk about the supplemental budget next week, I believe, and that's essentially, give or take, about 1 year of your budget. We talk a lot in Wyoming about what a great business climate we have from a taxation perspective. And I would argue, Mr. Chairman and Revenue Committee, that as the Revenue Committee, it's very, very important that you understand the way our taxation works. So when people are saying that and we get ranked as #1 in the business taxation climate and all that, which is all fantastic, that applies to businesses that are not mineral production companies. In fact, as it relates to oil and gas taxation, Wyoming is among the highest, if not the highest, taxation state among oil and gas states. Our effective tax rate is more than double Colorado's, and you know what they think about my industry. It's nearly triple New Mexico's. So it is very, very high. We're the only business that pays a corporate income tax. And we call it a severance tax, but it functions like a corporate income tax. And then, of course, we pay property taxes. To illustrate the disparity of property taxes, let me just give you this one anecdote, and then I'll pivot to the bill and the concept. So I'll just take one oil and gas project, the Pinedale Anticline over in western Wyoming. Over 15 years, that one project produced enough revenue, property tax revenue, to send 12,367 Wyoming kids to K through 12 education over those 15 years. Take the same 15 years and take the average property tax paid by a residential homeowner. Take that average and double it. Pay that for 15 years, and you've paid for one student to go through K through third grade. So I have 3 daughters. They're going through the public school system here in Cheyenne. It's fantastic. I'm not paying for that. The people I work for in the Petroleum Association are paying for that. So the reason why I bring all that up is because when you're talking about the overall taxation system in Wyoming, the extent to which we continue to drive a wedge between what oil and gas pays and what everybody else pays creates an unsustainable situation. So how did we get to where we are? You heard from the Board of Equalization about some of the history, Mr. Chairman. Back in the early to mid 1980s, we had a system that's contemplated by this bill where eventually the ratios and the assessments were so wildly different for every other class, not minerals, we've always been at 100%, that my predecessors in the Petroleum Association and my friend Mr. Detai's predecessors in the Mining Association sued the state because it was no longer constitutional the way that had worked. We prevailed at the Supreme Court, and that's what created eventually the amendments, and then this last amendment here too, that created the classes. But it essentially provides an umbrella still in terms of uniformity that we all, businesses, residential, industrial, we all can rely on that overarching market value. And then the constitutional amendments, and the one we just passed this past summer or fall, that creates residential at its own, gives you all a lot of authority to deal with it under that umbrella, different percentages. Then of course mill levies and all that. You can do a lot of that, and you can help residential and residential homeowners in that category. But when you start to chip away at that overarching umbrella, then it chips away at the constitutional rights of everybody who pays taxes here, including my members. So, Mr. Chairman, the good chairman and I have had long discussions on this, and he's an honorable man. And I know his desire to deal with what I mentioned earlier about our effective tax rates in Wyoming. So we've discussed this, and I trust the good chairman. And he knows where I am here too, but this for us it becomes a bridge too far. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Name and organization, please.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Tom Laycock, AARP Wyoming. We're a membership organization for people age 50 and over. Got about 75,000 members in the state. Mr. Chairman, the bill's sponsor here is, I think, one of the better ones we ever work with in terms of understanding what his constituents need, how they're hurting, what can be done to help. We've enjoyed like heck working with him on issues, especially around property tax relief as well as power issues. That said, we have some concerns with what this does in terms of eroding special district money, especially senior services districts and senior citizens districts. As well as the fact our national policy says that property tax relief should be equitable, cost-effective, and for those who are low and moderate income. So for that reason, we can't support the bill, but we certainly support the sponsor. Thank him for what he does.
Questions?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Thank you for coming today. My question for you is, would the members of your organization like to be able to have a predictable tax bill?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, good to see you. I don't think I've testified before. We think with the, certainly with the 50% long-term homeowners exemption, we think that certainly helps, as well as the property tax refund program, which offers anyone 145% or below the ability to apply for a refund on last year's taxes.
Representative Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lamach, I have several seniors that I've talked to in my district and seniors in my church who, after talking to them about something like this, they're really very much in favor of it. So I don't understand where you come in there. Could you explain that to me?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, while we certainly have policy around things along these lines, it doesn't mean that necessarily every one of our members or even every older adult in the state of Wyoming is in complete lockstep. I think a lot of it also depends on their level of knowledge about property tax and kind of what it does and how it, how it works. We make sure that every property tax conversation we have, we point out the first 72 cents of every dollar goes to the schools, next 18% to the counties. And then from there on, it goes down to special districts, community college districts, weed and pest districts, recreation districts, senior citizen service districts, groups, all like that. So there is a very healthy tension between the conversation for tax and services. And we've had a couple conversations in the last couple weeks with a community action team that we have in Cheyenne, as well as a conversation that we had at the senior center in Cheyenne too, where when we brought up some of these things and people saw that the financial impact, the first thing they said to us is, okay, well, here's the first step towards an income tax, I guess. So there's certainly a lot of different ways to look at it. Once again, educating people in the proper way is a big part of that. And as one of your constituents, I appreciate that you're trying to do that.
Any more questions? I need to apologize to Mr. Obermueller. Did anybody have any questions for Mr. Obermueller? Sorry about that. I apologize. All right, we're going to close public comment and bring it back to the chair. Committee, what's your pleasure on this bill?
Move the bill.
Moved by Lean, seconded by Brown. Discussion? Page 1, any changes? Any amendments? Page 2. Page 3. 4. 5, 6. 7, 8. 9, 10. 11, 12. 13, 14. 15, 16. 17, 18. 19. 20. 21. 22. 23. 24.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I'd just like to make a statement on the bill that I know we hear from our partners on the West about Prop 13 a lot, and I just want to mention that I have watched California grow, and their acquisition value has not harmed them. They've been able to provide their schools, their fire departments, their police. Having spoken with many constituents within my district, they are in favor of this. Many of them would like to go back to what they bought their homes for, and while I understand that that may not be an obtainable goal at this moment, I think this is a great start a great step in the right direction, and that if we can get this to the floor, that we have 62 great minds that represent the people of Wyoming, that we could walk through this legislation and see what the body as a whole thinks.
Question on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative Lane. Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I too would like to make a statement on this bill. So here's what I heard today. I heard that the bill is clearly unconstitutional, that it's difficult, if not impossible, to implement. It creates huge inequities. It has a lot of unintended consequences, and it costs a lot. And we already did study this issue. And that study, all of these issues were identified at that time. So if our goal is to bankrupt local communities, cost schools millions of dollars, invite litigation, increase our reliance on the fossil fuel industry, in order to give wealthy second homeowners the biggest tax breaks in the state, these are homeowners who already are benefiting from our low tax environment just by having a home here, then this bill is clearly the ticket. With the passage of Amendment A and the refund program, we have the ability to reduce property tax for the people who truly need it, but that is not what this bill does. Frankly, it's an affront. It's an affront to the state that has stood for 135 years, that we treat people equitably. It's an affront to what the people voted for almost 40 years ago, that we would use property tax to fund local governments and schools. That system has served the state really well. And it recognizes that a consistent source of funding that reflects population changes and thus the demand for those local services and schools really does make sense. And I haven't heard an argument today that says that that is not still the case. I actually lived in California when Prop 13 was passed. I voted against it. And it has hurt the state. It has hurt education. It has hurt the university system that frankly was a crown jewel for the state and the US. It has caused other taxes to go up because some services are still required. So I didn't hear the sponsor of this bill provide us with a solution for replacing these revenues. If we really want to go down this course, then we should actually try to figure out how we're going to replace those revenues and understand what that means for our local communities and our schools and what else we can do. Because the demand for services, as Commissioner Wilcox clearly identified, is not going to go away. So thank you. I'm on and against.
Go ahead, Representative Brown. Let's make this quick. We've got gavel in here
Mr.
shortly.
Chairman, I appreciate the former speaker's statement. However, I look at this bill and I feel it's really a very fair and equitable way for people to go get tax reform and for them to reduce their taxes. People over the last few years have been hurting, and we need to give them relief. And the last time that I checked, if you cut 10% off of a rich person's taxes and 10% off of a person in middle income, it's still 10%. Thank you.
Question on the bill? He's got to move it. Moved, seconded. Can you take roll, please?
This is a roll call vote on House Bill 282, property tax acquisition value. Representative Brown,
Aye.
Representative Campbell,
No.
Representative Lean,
Aye.
Representative Lucas,
Aye.
Representative Riggins excused, Representative Storer,
No.
Representative Stivar,
Aye.
Representative Worf left an absentee vote of aye. Chairman Locke. We have 6 aye, 2 no, and 1 excused, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for everybody for coming. I think we're probably out of time on that third bill. I'm sorry about that. I don't think we'll continue at recess today because my guess is it could be a very long day on the floor is my guess. So where we would normally try to continue at recess, I think we will probably not do that. We'll try to bring that bill maybe Tuesday if that would be okay. Thank you. We'll adjourn the meeting.